September 19, 1990, New York City. Inside the Ziegfeld Theater, audiences laughed at Jimmy 2 times. On screen, he was comic relief. In federal records, the name carried weight. When Goodfellas premiered, the nickname became a joke. But it did not begin in a screenplay. It appeared in indictments and organized crime investigations tied to Philadelphia and Boston. Prosecutors alleged James Martorano operated inside a structured criminal enterprise. The public remembers the punchline. The record tells a harder story. If you're here for the documented history, not the Hollywood version, stay with us. The real James. Jimmy 2 times Martorano. James Vincent Martorano was born in 1941 into a family already connected to organized crime in the northeastern United States. His father, Raymond Martorano, was a known narcotics trafficker with ties that stretched beyond Philadelphia. Crime was not an abstraction in his household. It was business. By the 1960s, Martorano had moved within the orbit of the Philadelphia crime family. He was not known for theatrics. Associates described him as controlled, observant, and disciplined. In an environment where words could cost money or lives, restraint had value. Federal prosecutors would later allege that Martorano participated in multiple murders between the late 1960s and early 1980s, many tied to internal disputes and shifting alliances within organized crime. In court filings and testimony, violence was framed not as impulse but as enforcement, removing rivals, stabilizing leadership, protecting income streams. He also operated as an earner. Gambling operations, loan sharking, and narcotics distribution formed part of the revenue network surrounding him. These were not freelance ventures. They were integrated into a hierarchy that answered upward to bosses and underbosses, each level taking a percentage. The nickname Jimmy 2 times existed in this world long before it reached a movie screen. It belonged to a man navigating a closed system where loyalty, silence, and calculation mattered more than image. The humor that later defined the name bore little resemblance to the life behind it. Business, not banter. The mechanics of power in Philadelphia. Philadelphia's organized crime structure in the 1970s operated like a private corporation layered over the city's legitimate economy. Leadership controlled territory. Captains managed crews. Associates generated cash through defined streams. Gambling parlors, sports betting, loan sharking, and increasingly, narcotics. Money flowed upward through a predictable system. A bookmaker collected weekly payments. A loan shark extended high-interest cash to small business owners who could not access traditional banks. Construction projects required labor peace. Labor peace required influence within unions. Influence required leverage, sometimes financial, sometimes coercive. Martorano functioned within this machinery. His value was not theatrical presence but reliability. When revenue was threatened by rivals or internal dissent, enforcement followed. Federal indictments later described these actions as part of broader power struggles that defined the Philadelphia crime family during periods of instability. The organization also depended on intermediaries. Lawyers structured shell businesses. Cash-intensive storefronts blended legitimate and illegitimate income. Political connections, while often indirect and difficult to document in full, provided insulation. Permits were delayed or expedited. Inspections were ignored. Contracts quietly aligned with friendly firms. Publicly, the city moved forward. New developments, union negotiations, expanding neighborhoods. Beneath that surface, a parallel authority influenced outcomes. It was not official. It did not appear on ballots, but it shaped decisions. In that system, jokes had no currency. Cash did. Control did. Silence did. Blood is risk management. From the late 1960s through the early 1980s, the Philadelphia crime family moved through one of its most unstable periods. Leadership shifted. Alliances fractured. Profitable rackets, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics distribution were contested internally and by rivals in neighboring cities. In that climate, instability meant lost revenue. Federal prosecutors would later allege that James Martorano took part in a series of murders connected to these disputes. In indictments and courtroom testimony years later, those acts were described not as random violence, but as deliberate removals, rivals who challenged authority, insiders who threatened to cooperate, figures whose presence disrupted financial order. Within organized crime, violence often functioned as a blunt form of governance. It sent signals. It resolved internal conflicts quickly. It discouraged independent ambition that could fracture a revenue base. The cost was immediate, but the objective was continuity. Philadelphia during this period was not isolated. Organized crime families in New York and New Jersey influenced decisions, approved leadership changes, and monitored territorial disputes. A destabilized Philadelphia market could ripple outward, affecting shared ventures and narcotics channels tied to broader East Coast networks. If the allegations laid out in later federal cases are accurate, Martorano operated as an instrument during this turbulence, tasked not with spectacle, but with enforcement. The public never saw those calculations. What remained visible were headlines about bodies and indictments. Inside the organization, the reasoning was simpler. Revenue required order, order required fear, and fear, once established, became another asset managed like cash. If you prefer the full record over the myth, consider subscribing. The Scarfo Era. Consolidation and control. By 1981, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo had secured control of the Philadelphia crime family after a period marked by instability and shifting loyalties. His ascent followed internal conflict and leadership struggles that had weakened the organization's coherence. Scarfo responded not with compromise but with consolidation. His leadership style was direct and rigid. Decision-making narrowed. Authority flowed downward from a smaller inner circle. Those who operated independently or failed to report earnings accurately faced swift repercussions. In Scarfo's structure, discipline was not symbolic, it was operational. Revenue streams were reorganized with precision. Gambling operations were expected to deliver predictable tribute payments. Loan sharking remained steady, but construction projects and labor unions took on elevated importance. Control over union influence meant leverage over city development, contract allocations, and work stoppages. Influence within these sectors translated into political capital, even if that influence operated indirectly. During the early 1980s, violence escalated. Federal indictments and later courtroom testimony described the period as one of intense internal enforcement and retaliation. Investigators characterized those years as among the most volatile in Philadelphia's organized crime history. Martorano's name appeared in proceedings tied to that era, connected to enforcement actions that prosecutors argued were designed to stabilize leadership and eliminate dissent. Scarfo aimed to impose order. A centralized hierarchy reduced freelancing and strengthened negotiations with allied families in New York and New Jersey. But centralization carried a cost. A more tightly controlled enterprise left clearer financial trails. Surveillance expanded. Informants gained significance. And as federal authorities leaned heavily on RICO statutes to pursue enterprise-level charges, the very structure that increased control also made the organization easier to map. Power became sharper, yet more fragile. Crossing the line. Drugs, state pressure, and federal strategy. By the early 1980s, federal prosecutors had changed their approach to organized crime. Instead of treating murders, extortion, and narcotics cases as isolated incidents, they began using a broader legal framework to present criminal groups as unified enterprises. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, made that strategy possible. The Department of Justice has outlined how RICO allows prosecutors to charge leaders for crimes carried out by subordinates if those acts further the enterprise. The Department of Justice lays out this framework clearly in its Justice Manual, a blueprint for prosecuting criminal enterprises as systems, not just suspects. It formalized what investigators had long sought, a way to dismantle structures, not just individuals. This shift altered the balance of power. Gambling operations, construction kickbacks, and narcotics distribution could now be presented as parts of a coordinated system. Surveillance was paired with financial analysis. Informants became critical assets. For figures operating inside these hierarchies, the risks multiplied. A single cooperating witness could expose years of activity. Conversations once believed private were replayed in federal courtrooms. Loyalty was no longer shield enough. The enterprise model that sustained organized crime for decades faced a legal model designed to map it from the top down. The conflict was no longer just territorial. It became structural: organization against institution, silence against documentation, the flight and the silent years. In 1993, facing serious federal charges in Boston connected to long-standing murder allegations, James Martorano failed to appear in court. The absence was immediate and deliberate. Rather than submit to arrest and prosecution, he vanished. He resurfaced years later in Florida. But in the interim, he lived under assumed names and carefully constructed routines. Reports from court proceedings later described a life built on caution, cash payments, limited paper trails, minimal attention. He moved through ordinary environments, rental properties, small-scale work, everyday transactions without drawing notice. To federal authorities, he became a wanted fugitive. Within the informal networks that once surrounded him, he was a liability but also a figure worth shielding. Mob structures have long depended on mobility. Safe houses, cooperative contacts in other states, and industries comfortable with cash transactions provide space to disappear. Florida, with its transient population and sprawling metropolitan areas, has historically offered anonymity to those seeking it. The same logistical knowledge used to route money or narcotics across jurisdictions can be adapted to move a person quietly. For nearly 8 years, Martorano avoided capture. During that period, federal investigations continued to evolve. Prosecutors pursued broader racketeering cases against leadership figures across the Northeast. Informants expanded case files. Old crimes were re-examined with new testimony. But fugitive status carries limits. In 2001, acting on information developed during ongoing investigations, authorities located and arrested him in Florida. He was returned to Boston to confront charges that had waited nearly a decade. By then, the landscape had shifted. The organization he once operated within had been weakened by prosecutions, and the state, increasingly patient and methodical, was prepared to negotiate from a position of strength. The deal with the state. In 2001, after years as a fugitive, James Martorano was arrested in Florida and returned to Boston to face federal charges. The allegations included multiple murders tied to organized crime conflicts stretching back decades. The case did not unfold before a jury in the traditional sense. Instead, a plea agreement was reached. In 2002, Martorano pleaded guilty in federal court to a series of murders and agreed to cooperate with authorities. The terms of his cooperation and sentencing were outlined in federal court filings and formal Drug Enforcement Administration releases. He ultimately received a 12-year sentence, a term that sparked debate among observers who questioned the proportionality of the punishment. The agreement reflected a pragmatic calculus. Prosecutors gained testimony that clarified unresolved cases. A defendant secured a defined prison term rather than risking life imprisonment after trial. It was not unusual. Major organized crime prosecutions have often relied on negotiated cooperation to unravel complex networks. What once bound members together, loyalty and silence, could be outweighed by the certainty of decades behind bars. In that courtroom, the machinery of organized crime met the machinery of federal law. Both operated on leverage. Both operated on calculation. And in that exchange, the narrative of a life shifted again, from enforcement inside an enterprise to cooperation within a federal case file. Cinema's erasure. Long before Martorano stood in a Boston courtroom and entered a plea, another version of his nickname had already taken on a life of its own. In September 1990, when Goodfellas premiered in New York City, audiences were introduced to a minor character known as Jimmy 2 Times. He appears briefly, repeating his words with comic rhythm. The exchange is quick. It draws laughter. The moment passes almost as soon as it begins. For most viewers, that was the entire story. The nickname existed inside the film and nowhere else. But outside the theater, the name had traveled through a different world, one shaped by indictments, surveillance, internal power struggles, and federal prosecutions. The real James Martorano's life unfolded primarily in Philadelphia and Boston, in networks unrelated to the narrative Scorsese portrayed. The film did not claim to document him. It did not attempt biography. It selected a name and placed it in a fictionalized environment crafted for storytelling. Over time, repetition solidified association. When a phrase is heard often enough in a popular film, it becomes culturally anchored. For many, Jimmy 2 Times now means a humorous cameo, not a record preserved in court transcripts. Cinema is not required to mirror history with precision, yet its reach often exceeds that of legal documentation. A single memorable scene can eclipse decades of criminal proceedings. It shapes shorthand memory. In federal archives, Martorano's identity is defined by case numbers, plea agreements, and sentencing outcomes. On screen, the same nickname survives as comic relief. Legacy in that sense is negotiated twice, once in court and once in culture. The bottom line: legacy, power, and the myth machine. When James "Jimmy" Martorano walked out of federal prison in 2007, the organization that had once defined his life was diminished. Federal prosecutions had fractured hierarchies. Informants had redrawn loyalties. The old structure of control in Philadelphia and Boston no longer operated with the same confidence. Yet his nickname lived on, not in court records, but in popular culture. Organized crime depends on silence, fear, and discipline. The state answers with indictments, plea bargains, and sentences. But cinema operates by a different logic. It selects fragments, reshapes them, and delivers something more memorable than transcripts ever could. Martorano's life sits at the intersection of those forces. A documented participant in violent criminal enterprises, a federal cooperator, a man whose name was detached from its history and reattached to fiction. So who defines legacy? The prosecutors who assemble the record, the streets that enforce their own order, or the screen that chooses what millions will remember? Because once a story becomes entertainment, it rarely returns to its original form. If you want the documented history behind the myth, consider subscribing for more historic videos.